Members of the diplomatic corps and academia, policy influencers, members of the press, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today for what will be an important discussion about the past, present, and future of the US-Hungarian relationship. My name is Jonas Stewart, and I am the Counselor for Public Affairs at the American Embassy in Budapest. The Embassy is honored and privileged to host today's event in partnership with Central European University and the CEU Democracy Institute. The Democracy Institute is a champion for the free exchange of ideas in Hungary, and I cannot think of a better partner for today's examination of the state of relations between our two countries. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Institute and the rest of our friends at CEU for their assistance, partnership, and patience in the planning of today's event. We have broken down the discussion this afternoon into 3 parts, each with very distinguished speakers who will share their views about US-Hungary relations, with particular focus on the impact of NATO as we honor the 25th anniversary this week of Hungary's accession to NATO. First, former Foreign Minister of Foreign Affairs, Ambassador Géza Yazinski, will reflect on the early days of Hungary's entry into NATO a quarter of a century ago. Following Ambassador Jeszenszky's remarks, Johns Hopkins doctoral candidate and recovering New York Times Budapest reporter, Ben Novak, will moderate a discussion between Peter Krejko from Political Capital, Dora Gyorfi from Corvinus University, and Zsuzsanna Vég from the German Marshall Fund, who will share thoughts about the current state of the relationship. Finally, U.S. Ambassador David Pressman will deliver a keynote address, speaking not only to the past and present of the relationship, but with an eye to the future. Following today's event, we welcome all guests to join us for an off-the-record coffee in the atrium, or as it's known here, the Harry Potter room, up that way, across the hallway upstairs. And now I would like to welcome Ambassador Yazinski to the stage to deliver his remarks.
Ambassador Pressman, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Well, I'm very pleased that there is this opportunity to remember what happened 2 days and 25 years ago when Hungary joined or signed our accession to the Washington Treaty. The title of my short talk is NATO Becoming a Safe Harbor for Central Europe. Both world wars started in Central Europe by aggressive great powers. Having become free from Soviet domination, today the freedom of Central Europe is at risk. As President Biden said in his last State of the Union address, quote, "What makes our moment rare is that freedom and democracy are under attack, both at home and overseas, at the very same time. Overseas, Putin of Russia is on the march, invading Ukraine and sowing chaos throughout Europe and beyond." End of quote. All through the years of communism, the vast majority of Central Europeans looked at the West and NATO as the ultimate hope that one day freedom would be restored to them. Hungary's Prime Minister Antal addressed the Atlantic Council on the 28th of October 1991 and expressed his gratitude for NATO, quote, "The creation of NATO in 1949 was a source of hope for the peoples who remained behind the Iron Curtain. For we knew that if Western Europe did not remain stable, if the presence of North America in Europe came to an end, there wouldn't be any solid ground left for us to base our hopes upon." End quote. 25 years ago, on the 12th of March 1999, 3 former members of the one-time Warsaw Pact, 3 nations who had several times showed their opposition to communism and Soviet domination, became members of the Atlantic Alliance. 5 years later, with a big bang, the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, and Slovenia followed suit. Those 2 steps provided a remarkable boost for post-Cold War peace and security. Following the fall of the communist dominoes, Hungary, starting with Prime Minister Antall's stand in Moscow on June the 7th, 1990, at the summit of the Warsaw Pact, was a vanguard in the process of ending the last vestiges of Soviet domination. The United States and its allies did not urge the disbanding of that alliance of the unwilling. On the contrary, they tried to slow the process down, to put brakes on it so as not to offend the sensitivities of Russia and not to endanger Gorbachev's position. However, the Visegrad cooperation, established on the 15th of February 1991 in Budapest, together with Poland and Czechoslovakia, we were adamant on the dissolution of the pact, and that was achieved a few months later on July the 1st, with the last Soviet leaders' reluctant consent. We, the Central European anti-communist Democrats, were convinced that the fundamental political changes of 1989-1990 could be guaranteed only by membership in NATO, and so the intention to join the alliance was publicly announced at the Prague summit of the Visegrad III, then in May 1992. That wasn't received with enthusiasm. NATO was a cozy club, not keen on admitting countries, possibly with spies, coming in from the cold. But a no man's land east of NATO would have been an invitation for Russia's communist nationalist, so-called red-brown forces, to try reclaiming the near abroad, the former satellites. Bill Clinton, who was elected president of the United States in November 1992, declared the consolidation of Russia's democratic tradition and its integration into the community of democratic states to be the greatest task of his foreign policy. At the same time, he was deeply influenced by the leaders of Central Europe who told the history of their countries under Soviet control and put forward arguments in favor of NATO membership. Ron Asmus, Steve Larrabee, and others played a crucial role in convincing the American public about the wisdom of enlargement. Asmus, who left us far too early, explained that, quote, "The purpose of NATO enlargement was to help lock in a new order of peace in Europe following communism's collapse at the end of the Cold War. We wanted to promote a process of pan-European integration and reconciliation that would make the prospect of armed conflict as inconceivable in the eastern half of Europe as it had become in the western part. It was also our hope that new allies from Central and Eastern Europe, having fought hard to regain their freedom and independence, would also bring fresh blood, ideas, and enthusiasm to NATO and help us transform it for a new era." End quote. The prospect of joining the alliance proved a strong incentive for reducing tensions between the applicant countries, and it encouraged the conclusion of important bilateral accords, treaties, they signed with each other. Hungary did that with 5 of its neighbors. Russia's opposition to expanding, or more diplomatically, enlarging NATO was the biggest obstacle to be cleared by the Central European applicants for membership. As foreign minister and later as member of the Hungarian parliament, I argued that the expansion of the area of stability and security in what the Russians somewhat alarmingly called near abroad would not harm Russian interests, let alone pose a threat. On the contrary, it would help to make the western border zone of Russia safer and even prosperous, providing an attractive prospect for Russia itself. I met Russian politicians who agreed privately, but the official position of Russia did not concur. The American and Central European advocates of enlargement welcomed with great satisfaction the news from Warsaw on the 25th of August 1993 that President Yeltsin, after a lengthy discussion with Polish President Lech Walesa, had welcomed with understanding Poland's aspirations to NATO membership. Quote, "Such a decision by a sovereign Poland does not prejudice the interests of other states, including Russia," end quote, said Yeltsin. In the mid-1990s, even the possibility of Russia joining NATO was raised on several occasions. Yeltsin was sympathetic to the idea of belonging to an alliance that would guarantee peace and security, and his foreign minister, Andrei Kozyriev, a good friend of mine, was determined, and President of the United States now in Florida, he was determined to see Russia's future in cooperation with the West. But the majority of the Russian parliament and military leadership continued to see America and its allies as the enemy. A temporary solution was the Partnership for Peace plan, launched in October 1993. Prime Minister Antal, who was fighting a heroic battle against cancer, argued then in letters to President Clinton for enlargement, with further arguments. It was a great achievement when Madeleine Albright, then UN ambassador and later foreign minister, in the company of chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, John Shalikashvili, and foreign ministry advisor Charles Gatti, visiting Budapest on January the 8th, 1994, stated that it was no longer a question of whether NATO would be enlarged, only when and how. That pledge was made official by the declaration of the NATO summit in Brussels on the 11th of January, and followed by President Clinton's announcement at the US Visegrad summit in Prague on the 12th of January. That marked the realization of the late Prime Minister Antal's major goal, to make the former Soviet bloc Hungary a free and independent democracy and an ally of the world's strongest democrats. Why did it take 5 years to implement the decision in principle? Because the West wanted to take Russia's sensitivities into account. Clinton and his administration waged a parallel struggle to convince American public and the politicians of the justification for enlargement, and to reassure Russia to reduce its Cold War reflexes. Myself, as president then of the Hungarian Atlantic Council, worked intensively for our membership in lectures and meetings in the US and in Hungary. No one ever told me that we could not be admitted to NATO because there was a secret promise that there would be no enlargement to the east. The President of the United States made it clear to Yeltsin and to Russian politicians, including Primakov, then foreign minister, who were far more distrustful of the West than Yeltsin, that there would be enlargement in any case, and that is up to Russia what kind of relationship it wants with the new NATO. The result was the decision at the Madrid summit in June 1997 to invite 3 former captive nations to join the Atlantic Alliance. Thanks to NATO membership, the states liberated from long Soviet oppression have arrived in a safe harbor. Hungary and all the members of the Atlantic Alliance should stick together facing the present aggression. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Jeszenszky. Now, I would like to invite our panelists, Dor Gjorfi, Peter Kreko, and Zsuzsanna Vég, and our moderator, Ben Novak, to the stage. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes, there we go. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. Nearly 35 years ago, at the reburial of Imre Nagy, a shaggy-haired liberal stepped up to the podium and blamed the one-party state of unconditionally serving the Russian Empire. And referring to the uprising in 1956, of drowning our revolution in blood and forcing us back into the Asian dead end that we are now trying to find a way out of. It was a pivotal moment in history. And Hungary, it appeared, was breaking out of that dead end. The following year, Hungary held its first democratic elections. Hungary went on to sign the Treaty of Paris in 1990, and it also joined the Council of Europe. In 1994, it was in this very city that nuclear superpowers signed an important memorandum on security assurances for, among others, Ukraine. In 1999, Hungary joined NATO, and 5 years later, Hungary became a member of the European Union. Who would have imagined, back in the years following the end of the Cold War, that a nuclear superpower would launch a brutal war of aggression in Europe, one with genocidal overtones, no less. But time flies, things changed, and it happened. Some argue that NATO is a relic of the Cold War, an unnecessary military alliance in the 21st century. Some even say it's an obstacle to economic and political cooperation with powers that don't share in the West's so-called tradition of democracy. But as Russia's brutal war of aggression has shown, many in the transatlantic community see NATO as a bulwark for their own peace, economic stability, and democratic way of life. In fact, the war right next door has caused NATO to grow. We are here today because Hungary joined the alliance a quarter century ago. And it is my honor to share a stage with this esteemed group of experts to discuss what NATO meant and means for Hungary, and to speak openly about the challenges and opportunities Hungary has in the alliance. Just a little caveat here, we are not military people, and it's good that we're not military people. We will be coming at this conversation purely from the political angle, nothing on the operative level whatsoever. So please allow me to introduce our panelists here. We have Dr. Peter Krekó, Executive Director of Political Capital, Dóra Györfi, a professor at Corvinus University here in Budapest, and Zsuzsanna Vég, who is a visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. They will each make some opening remarks, and we'll follow that up with a discussion. So I would ask that Dóra begin, and then we'll pivot to Zsuzsanna and Peter.
Thank you. It is a great honor for me to be here and participate in a panel celebrating the 25th anniversary of Hungarian NATO accession. My main message today is that with the resurgence of Russian aggression, NATO is even more important for us today than it was when we joined.
Can we have a mic check here, please?
Okay. Hopefully it works. So my main message today is that with the resurgence of Russian aggression, NATO is even more important for us today than it was when we joined. We live in a time and place when it is important to clearly state the obvious. Hungary has ample historical experience with the threats Russia poses to the region. We are celebrating March 15 tomorrow, and we remember that the War of Independence in 1848-1849 was defeated with Russian assistance. In 1945, the Soviet Red Army entered Hungary and was unwilling to leave until 1990. In 1956, Hungarians revolted against the communist regime, but the Soviet army crushed the revolution. When Hungary entered NATO in 1999, it reflected a desire to finally join the West and protect itself from the Russian threat. After having Soviet troops on our soil for 45 years, the nation was united in its desire not to have Soviet or Russian army here ever again. Leaving the Warsaw Pact was impossible in 1956, and being able to join NATO in 1999 affirmed the fact that our sovereignty was finally restored. We were free to choose our own alliance. In 1999, Vladimir Putin had just assumed power. Russia was very weak and suffered from social and economic crisis. While there was a war accompanying the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, it did not really represent a threat to other countries in our region. Many believed that a real war was a thing of the past. By 2007, Russia has stabilized its economy, Putin had dealt with the oligarchs, and his speech in the Munich Security Conference made it clear that he was ready to fulfill his international ambitions. As a former KGB officer, he always believed that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a historical tragedy, and he aimed to restore the Russian Empire and the Russian sphere of influence. War became a reality as the Russians invaded Georgia in 2008, intervened in the Syrian civil war, and occupied Crimea in 2014. A war has started against NATO countries as well, but at the time it was a covert war, as Russia has perfected its tools of sharp power and hybrid warfare. These include cyber attacks, supporting parties on the far right and the far left, strategic corruption, as well as the building up of economic positions which can be weaponized when necessary, facilitating refugee crisis in the EU, then weaponizing the fear of migration, as it was done in 2015 during the Syrian war, and in 2023 on the Belarusian-Polish border is also part of the toolbox. While many hoped and believed that hybrid warfare was replacing traditional war, the aggression in Ukraine shows that this is an illusion. Hybrid warfare proved to be the precursor to real war. When the enemy seems weak enough, Russia attacks. Weakness provokes aggression. As Russia tries to regain its former sphere of influence, we should have no illusions that its aims stop in Ukraine. It has been waging hybrid attacks against the transatlantic alliance for more than a decade, and it took the aggression towards Ukraine to wake up to this reality in the West. At least for most countries in NATO. And I am deeply sad to say that Hungarians seem to be the least aware of these dangers in the whole alliance. Still, we cannot remain blind to the fact that lately there have been regular threats against the Baltics, Poland, and even the UK. Nuclear threats have also become regular, and the mining of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant represents an acute danger as we speak. Article 5 of NATO has never been more essential for the security of our region. Any doubt about its credibility is likely to provoke a Russian attack. Hungary cannot cherish the illusion that we can stay out of it, or we can make a deal with the aggressor. We have the experience of 2 world wars showing where this kind of thinking leads. To end on a more optimistic note, I want to underline that when Hungary joined the NATO 25 years ago, it joined the strongest military alliance in the world. This is still true today. NATO members' GDP is almost 10 times of that of Russia. The alliance is expanding, and the accession of Finland and Sweden makes it even stronger. There is every reason to believe that the alliance can deter Russian aggression. At the same time, we should never ever take our security for granted. A strong NATO is Hungary's fundamental national security interest, a fact that is even more true today than it was 25 years ago. Just to state the obvious. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Although Ben was saying that we are no military experts and we will not talk about the operational level, before diving into the political, I would still like to juxtapose the differences that we can today observe between Hungary's operational commitment and performance in NATO and what we can observe on the political level, because I do believe that it is increasingly more and more striking. I think if you look at the operational level, posing the question, what has NATO ever done for us and what have we done for NATO, I think there is a lot to actually list. Of course, Dora was underlining the importance of NATO for the region, for Hungary's security, and on the more practical level, we can also think of the fact that being in NATO vastly contributed to Hungary's modernization of the military, the professionalization of the armed forces, the eventual achievement of the 2% defense spending, which probably wouldn't have been achieved without Hungary's NATO membership. On the other hand, NATO also provided the opportunity for Hungary to participate in international missions, which greatly contributed to the training of military staff. And of course, this contribution should also be acknowledged. These troops who have been present in international missions are highly regarded if we just think of Hungary's participation in missions in the Western Balkans, in KFOR, for example. These are crucial and these are really important contributions, and I do believe that we do see this as an added value towards both NATO as an alliance and for Hungary as a member state in NATO. And all this comes in addition to NATO being the ultimate security provider in the region. Article 5 being the defense guarantee for the country. Just as it was the case 25 years ago, it is the case today that NATO is the cornerstone of Hungary's security. Yet, what we increasingly see on the political as opposed to the operational level is that the political elite of Hungary, the governing political elite of Hungary, seems to disregard this cornerstone, seems to act against the interests of the alliance, seems to act against the interests of the country in certain cases, as if it had a very different threat perception than its regional partners. Foreign Minister Jeszenszky have pointed out that back in the 90s, there was a joint understanding of the countries that joined in 99 that this is a choice. These countries are choosing to belong to NATO. They take their sovereign right to pick what alliance they pick as a home. There was also a shared understanding of what may pose a security threat in the region. Yet, if we look at the past 2 years especially, it seems as if the Hungarian government is watching a completely different movie than, for example, the Polish. There is an apparent discrepancy in the perception of security threats, whereas on the operational level, we do continue to see the military commitment being present. But a question arises, can Hungary still act as a reliable and credible security partner if we do see this discrepancy between the operational and the political? So if we look at the political level, what does the past few years of the government's behavior really show us? Ultimately, what we see is, as opposed to the 2000s especially, there is an increasing politicization, or maybe we could even say political instrumentalization of security and security matters related to NATO. Just like the Fidesz government's approach to foreign policy in general, we see that blackmail, abuse of vulnerable situation is becoming a staple in the toolkit, in the political toolkit of the government. Thinking back just to the couple past years, Hungary blocking the convenience of the Ukraine-NATO Council is one example in the context of Ukraine being under an attack of an aggressor that challenges international law, international norms that NATO has vouched to also uphold when it comes to its own alliance. If we look at just the very recent past, upholding the accession of Finland and Sweden, especially in the case of Sweden, when there are negotiations going on about the acquisition of new Gripens, it just looks really unfounded, therefore politically motivated. These acts, not to mention the Hungarian government echoing certain Russian narratives that challenge the security order in the region, cast the shadow of unreliability on Hungary as a political and security partner in the region. It shows a lack of solidarity towards neighbors and also shows a lack of solidarity towards partners in the European Union with whom, in the framework of the EU, actually Hungary is also supposed to cooperate, also in security and defense matters. So this discrepancy is not a good look for the country. It undermines the country's credibility. It goes against the country's own national security interests. So if we consider that 25 years ago, it was a Fidesz government, a Fidesz foreign minister, who actually signed Hungary's accession treaty to NATO, and we look at the lack of proper acknowledgement of the 25-year anniversary today, I think the difference is striking. While Hungary still does deliver on the operational level, the credibility of commitment is fundamentally challenged due to the political behavior of this government. And why am I hammering on this point so much is that I believe that NATO is fundamentally built on credibility. It is built on the credible deterrence, the credible commitment of the members of the alliance. It is built on trust between the allies, and that is something that the current Hungarian government, despite the operational commitment, has become to significantly erode over the past several years. And I do think that this, and I will unfortunately end on this probably very negative note, I do believe that this is a key problem for the alliance and its security provider status in the region as such, even if Hungary is a small country. But if we look across the Atlantic, we do see what consequences questioning that commitment and questioning the credibility, especially of Article 5, could pose for the alliance if it comes on the bigger scale. Thank you very much.
So, hi everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation for the US Embassy in Budapest and for Ambassador Pressman, and also for the CU Democracy Institute. And I will rather start with some celebratory statements because we are partially here to celebrate our 25th anniversary of membership of NATO, and I think we have a good reason to celebrate. And I would start by saying that if we just look at the genesis in the public opinion of the NATO membership, at the time of the referendum in 1997, 16th of November, 85% of Hungarians voted in favor of accession to NATO, which is a pretty high figure. Okay, the turnout was 49%, but public opinion polls practically showed that the distribution of agreement is more or less the same in the overall population. Also, support is strong towards NATO nowadays as well, even if there are narratives, even coming from the highest level, that are sometimes challenging the image of NATO as a provider of security and peace. So, according to a poll that was conducted last year by Policy Solutions, 76% of Hungarians now would reaffirm their commitment to NATO membership if a referendum was held now. Some other polls indicate lower figures, but I think we can generally say that the Hungarian public opinion have a very strong pro-NATO stance still, despite all the turbulences. And it's important to remind ourselves of that, and also to the fact that the NATO membership have never been really challenged on the political landscape, only from marginal forces on the radical left and on the radical right. Also, we can say that in Hungary, in comparison with some other NATO countries, and I'm not saying that to point fingers on other countries, just to put in context, we hear a lot about, for good reasons, about the lack of credibility of Hungary as a NATO partner or the question marks around that, and Géza have mentioned them already. But it's also important that if we take a look at the public, there is no deeply rooted anti-Americanism, there is no deeply rooted anti-NATO sentiments in Hungary, and in some other member states where, let's say, pan-Slavic ideologies could, let's say, flourish, and there is stronger sympathy towards Russia in, let's say, Slovakia, Bulgaria, or in other countries like in Greece, where there are some religious ties to Russia. This support towards Russia and the antipathy towards NATO is traditionally higher and still is higher. So Hungary, when it comes to the public opinion, I think, despite all turbulences, is very strong in its support towards NATO. Of course, foreign policy and also, I think, so defense policy has the nature that it not always follows the line of the public opinion. And there is usually a bigger distance. And we can see this bigger distance these days as well, because Slovakia, Bulgaria, for example, have, I think they were more vocal and also more active in their support, for example, towards Ukraine after the beginning of the invasion than Hungary was. And this pro-peace narrative that is flourishing in Hungary is not only, we can hear it all over Europe, but I think it have practically nowhere been so loud from the governmental side than it was in Hungary. Also, there is a new development that can partially challenge this strong support towards NATO, and this is that NATO in a lot of cases is depicted, unfortunately, as somehow the cause of the invasion of Russia against Ukraine, and not as the security provider. And I find this narrative absolutely false and also extremely dangerous for the long-term security of Hungary. But still, after more than a year of such messages, we can still see a strong support towards NATO. I think it's also important to put the Hungarian divergence from NATO mainstream, which we can see in a few instances, like delaying the ratification of Finland's and mostly Sweden's NATO accession, into broader context. And my opinion would be that Hungary could not really divert, and possibly not even wanted to ever really divert Western responses towards Russia and Ukraine of the Transatlantic Alliance. So, and on an optimistic note again, I think since the beginning of the invasion, NATO have shown its strength, its unity, more than almost ever before, even if the disagreements becoming louder today when it comes to joint actions, when it comes to sanctions, if we talk about the European Union as well. And Hungary, despite the rhetoric that suggested otherwise, was mostly part of these common responses of the Euro-Atlantic Alliance, and I think it's important to remind ourselves of that. Right now we have two new members of the military alliance, Finland and Sweden, and I think it's also a good opportunity to celebrate their membership. And I think the braveness of these countries also show an important model for the rest of the Transatlantic Alliance. There were many threats from Russia that if they join NATO, Finland and Sweden, what will happen to these countries? And I don't want to quote these statements because they are, first of all, empty threats. Second, I think disgraceful, both for Russia and definitely for the receiving countries. And it seems that the public opinion did not take them seriously. And was either Finland or Sweden was subject to the attacks that Russia projected in case that they joined the NATO? Not at all. So maybe it's a message for the West that some of the threats of Russia should not really be taken seriously. And I would stop here.
Thank you. guess I'll follow up with a question directly to Peter. I once read a piece by a journalist named John Barron. He wrote this piece in the early 80s, and in this piece he describes KGB active measures. And there's this brilliant quote in this piece, and I want to throw this at you and kind of ask you to maybe help contextualize this in the Hungarian context. The quote is from a KGB major who defected to the United States. His name is Stanislav Levchenko, and here's the quote. "Few people who understand the reality of the Soviet Union will knowingly support it or its policies. By active measures, the KGB distorts or inverts reality. The trick is to make people support Soviet policy unwittingly by convincing them that they are supporting something else. Almost everybody wants peace and fears war. Therefore, by every conceivable means, the KGB plans and coordinates campaigns to persuade the public that whatever America does endangers peace, and that whatever the Soviet Union proposes furthers peace. To be for America is to be for war. To be for the Soviets is to be for peace. That's the active measures, a sort of made-in-Moscow black magic. It is tragic to see how well it works," end quote. Last week, after returning from his meeting with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago, Prime Minister Orban gave an interview, and he said something that reminded me of this quote. He said, "There is a pro-war government in Washington. The Democrats gave this president, and he is committed to war. But we are a pro-peace government." You have studied this government's propaganda ad nauseum. How do messages like this resonate with the Hungarian public? And what do such messages say about the government's efforts to steer public opinion?
Yeah, thank you for a brilliant question. I think that what we can clearly see in the polls is that governmental messaging has a clear, visible, and obvious impact on the public opinion. Just to tell you two examples that are directly related to that, when the invasion of Russia against Ukraine have started, according to the polls, majority of the Fidesz voters, in line with the overall population, blamed, for good reasons, Moscow for this invasion. As time passed and we approached the election day in 2022, the blame game have completely changed, and the majority of Fidesz voters, and since then we can still see it in the polls, blame first Ukraine, second the United States, and only third Russia as responsible for the conflict. And it was the result of a quite intense campaign that put the blame on the warmongers and were rather silent about the responsibility of Russia from the very beginning. So did it resonate with the public? It did resonate after this campaign. So I think in Hungary the public opinion is more the consequence of political campaigns than the cause of them. So if you transform the public, if you say to the people that, yes, if you support the opposition, for example, then they will bring the country into the war. And another piece of data on that, more than half of the Hungarian population made their choice in 2022 on the election day, thinking that if the opposition wins, then they will recruit average Hungarians to go to Ukraine and fight against the Russians. So ordinary Hungarians will be recruited. More than half of the population and the significant part of even the opposition voters thought so. Did the opposition have any plans to recruit everyday Hungarians who would not be very efficient in a military campaign, let's say, so if they did not receive military training, most of them, but was there any plan like that? Not at all, but the majority of the public made their choice believing in that. So my point would be that yes, these are highly efficient campaigns, and we can also see it on the public perception of Poland. And just one piece of data following up the line of what Géza have said about the differences between Poland and Hungary. Right now we arrived to the point where the views of the United States are highly different between Poland and Hungary, and it was not like that before. 93% of of the Polish electorate views the United States favorable and only 4% unfavorable. In Hungary, 51% of the population see the United States unfavorable, so the overall majority of the population, and only 44% see it as favorable. And I think this is pretty much the consequence of this public campaign and the peace rhetoric that you have just mentioned.
So if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that on February 24th, the war breaks out. We are just over a month away from an election in Hungary. The government's response is to say we're going to turn this into a black-white binary peace war. Opposition is for peace. That they had such a thorough and effective campaign that they cannot deviate from that message at this point, that they've painted themselves into a corner rhetorically?
I do think that from the very beginning of the invasion, the Hungarian government would have a different choice as well. And this different choice is to emphasize that there is no other place to be safe than NATO. There is no other way to keep our safety than NATO membership. There were politicians in Europe who, revisited their relationship with Putin, who revisited their attitudes towards Russia. I think if such extraordinary event happens, then you can do that. But it rather seems that the government, fall into the trap of its own anti-Western rhetoric, that it's not new. It started more than a decade ago, and it rather jumped on that train. But I do think that especially when it comes to foreign policy, you have a huge opportunity to shape the public opinion, especially with this media conglomerate. So I always found these explanations rather weak, that the government has to emphasize its outlier attitude to Russia and also its distance from NATO, because this is what the public opinion wants. This is not what the public opinion wants. This is where the governments want to shift the Hungarian public opinion.
Okay, just one brief follow-up. Then to what end?
Ask some governmental members about that. I'm not entitled to respond to this question.
Fair enough. Zsuzsanna, you did mention some regional dynamics, and I hope maybe you can elaborate here. How has the Hungarian government's position on Ukraine and European security affected its regional relationships and more broadly its posture and position within the European Union?
Well, significantly, obviously. I think the most apparent shift is in the relations with Poland, and especially considering that up until the full-scale invasion, Viktor Orbán and his Fidesz party has been very much counting on building a stronger national conservative or radical right alliance in the European Union with the help of the Polish Law and Justice Party. And Law and Justice has been Fidesz's strongest regional political ally for quite a while, and this relationship has been fundamentally affected by the government's position on Ukraine. Now, just a small caveat here, I think we need to make it clear that the type of diplomacy that the Hungarian government pursues is not traditional diplomacy. It's not interstate diplomacy. The Hungarian government is following inter-party diplomacy, and that is true for the region as well. So that's what then manifested in how Hungarian-Polish relations under the Fidesz and Law and Justice governments have started to break down. So taking one step back, Fidesz was very much counting on its Polish ally, Law and Justice, to bring about a strong European alliance of radical right national conservative parties, and that is off the table for now. Even ahead of the European parliamentary elections, we see that the positions on Ukraine and Russia are still a major obstacle here, and Orbán, who back in 2020 still try to position himself as a mediator between such forces is essentially no longer setting the terms of this alliance building. So in this regard, he actually politically suffered from this. He sidelined himself when it comes to this alliance building. And when it comes to Polish-Hungarian relations, although, yes, obviously the fundamental Dwa bratanki slogan is there and remains to be there, and I don't think that this necessarily affected the societal relations as such. We do not see this relationship really warming up between the two countries. That's the major shift. Yeah, I think I would leave it here.
It was striking to see, though. I believe it was this past weekend with President Duda and Prime Minister Tusk visited the White House and met with the U.S. president. So, given the political dynamics in Poland, to see that these two gentlemen sharing a table on an issue that to them is seen as a national interest.
Exactly.
So party politics, as you mentioned, we're not the dictating factors in that.
And I think, sorry, just one thought on this. I think that's a fundamental difference here between Fidesz and Orbán and the Polish political actors as such. For Poland, the Polish political elite, this is an existential issue that unites them. For Hungary, and I agree with Peter that Fidesz does shape political public opinion. It could have been addressed as a strategic existential issue for the country. I mean, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because it is a strategic issue for Hungary. But instead, and here again what I said about the political instrumentalization of security matters, the governing parties decided to frame it and instrumentalize it in a polarizing matter, dividing the political elite of the country, disregarding the fact that this is actually a fundamental security threat for the region. And there the two countries really fundamentally differ and continue to differ.
Thank you. Dora, I was hoping that I might ask you kind of zoom out of just Hungary alone here and Russia, and maybe kind of spread that net, so to speak. Russia and China have what we might describe as a strategic alliance. And I'm hoping you might be able to flesh this topic out a bit more. What we see is that Hungary has a significant energy dependency towards Russia. And the Hungarian government has increasingly strong ties with the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese economic interests coming into Hungary. Do you think that Hungary specifically plays a role in in Russia and or China's grand strategy? And if so, how is the Hungarian government responding to this? And one more follow-up to that, does that have any implications for Hungary within the alliance?
Wow, great questions. Yes, so Hungary definitely seems to be playing an important role in Russian and Chinese strategy. And this role is assured for Hungary by the fact that it is member of NATO and member of the European Union. And these institutions have particular rules about unanimity. So it's enough for a single country to postpone or hinder a decision. And we have seen this regarding sanctions.
Are you saying they only like us for our vote?
Well, Hungary would have a very, very different position vis-à-vis these two large powers if it wasn't member of the alliance. So basically, Hungary is used in the sense for Russia and China. And this can be seen from a number of facts. The Hungarian Prime Minister is regularly featured in Russian state media, and there are special ties with the Chinese Communist Party. Now there is even an agreement. challenging our sovereignty, by the way, that Chinese police can work in Hungary. So that's an issue. But what Hungary gets out of it is a question. The government justifies the Russian ties with energy dependence. Basically, every other country around us was able to reduce this dependence. The Hungarian government has not done enough for that. Regarding the Chinese relations, it is justified by attracting Chinese investments. I don't want to start on that because it would be too long, but basically it costs the Hungarian taxpayers a lot of money, and the government have been unable to show that what exactly are the economic benefits for Hungary from these investments, which are very harmful to the environment. So how does it affect Hungary's position in the alliance? Obviously, there is an alienation, and Géza has been talking about the breakdown of regional relations for Hungary, and also breeding distrust in the alliance. There are no mechanisms in NATO or even the EU where a country can be kicked out, but still we have to say that the Hungarian government is playing with fire by doing what it's doing. And we have the experience of 2 world wars, as I have mentioned, to see what tragedy this kind of policies can lead to. I do hope that the government stops at the edge of the precipice before we fall into it. And there is a tendency that it has done so. So basically, Hungary finally signed Swedish accession. It voted for all the Russian sanctions. So there is this sense that it doesn't want to leave the alliance, but still it's a very dangerous play, and I can only hope that we stop at the edge of the precipice.
I suppose this is as good a time as any to address the elephant in the room. As we're all aware, former President Donald Trump isn't the biggest fan of NATO. And after a meeting with the former president last week, Mr. Orbán said that if elected president, Donald Trump would end financial support for Ukraine. Mr. Orbán seems happy with this because in his view, I imagine this means peace. What would such a policy shift from the United States mean for European security, for NATO? And why is Mr. Orbán so happy about this? And this is it's a softball for all of you.
Yeah, brief response. Yes, I think there is a widespread belief and it's not just in the American and Hungarian populist right, but it's all over. I think European, let's say, radical right, and also radical left. Let's be clear about that peace should be achieved via a quick surrender of Ukraine. And the quicker the West stops to provide weapons to Ukraine, the better it is going to be both for Ukraine, both for the rest of Europe and the world. And I find this argument so absurd that I think it's even difficult to debunk because it just lacks any kind of logical consistency. And and if we just look back at Vladimir Putin's speech right after the annexation of Crimea, when he told it quite openly that anyone else living in Ukraine shouldn't be afraid that Russia wants to go further. And he delivered his speech to people of Donbass, Zaporozhye, and others, and told that you shouldn't be afraid. We will stop here. We only wanted to take back Crimea, but all the rest of the citizens of Ukraine, of course citizens of Crimea as well, shouldn't be worried. And then a few years later, we could see what's happening. So how can you make a peace deal with a partner that is so unreliable and so openly lying to the public? And even it was denying for a while that even Russian troops are on Crimea, and the list goes on. So I think this false statement is really popular, not only among the political elites, but there is unfortunately such a thing as Ukraine fatigue. And we talked a lot about that where it was not here, right now it's here. It's there at the US politics, and it's there at European politics, and I think it has an impact on both the political elite and both the public. What would be the consequence of that on European security? I think it would be pretty tragic. There is one positive side effect of these threats that, when it comes to congressional decisions, it's already a reality of withdrawal of some support of the United States from Ukraine, and this is that Europe is waking up. And I think it does not wake up quick enough. We can see in the hesitance of some of the biggest member states as well to provide security for Ukraine and efficient weapons. But it seems right now we are raising questions in Europe about should NATO troops be on the ground in Ukraine, and these are serious discussions. I think it just shows the huge shift that happened in Europe. So I do think that Europe can become stronger as a result of these threats. I do think, though, that part of this game that is going on in the United States is about the binarism of a highly polarized landscape, and maybe even if the Republicans will be in power, then the reality will be a big different. And let's just remind ourselves that it was Donald Trump who, and it was under Trump's presidency that Ukraine received the first javelins, the quite efficient weapons. So we can be hopeful about that, but I think it's good if Europe just wakes up to this threat. On the other hand, I do not really see that Hungarian, let's say, Hungary and the general region could really benefit from the delivery of the promises that Trump and his camp are making in the campaign. And just to make one more example, if the US economy is becoming more protectionist, then it could even mean that, for example, less German cars will be exported to the United States. Will it bring any good for the countries of the region? I'm not entirely sure. I think that right now that Russia and China is teaming up, the only good way for Europe to somehow find an economic and security way out of all this crisis and is to strengthen the relationship with the United States. Of course, it's a two-sided story, but I think the European part is also important.
Anybody else want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to argue a little bit with Peter, who said that maybe it's not going to be so bad if Trump assumes power again. I think his second term would be very different from the first term. Basically, he got rid of all the people who constrained him during the first term, and what I read from the American news, he's going to fill up his administration with people who he can trust, who are loyal and who are following that isolationist agenda that he's proposing. Regarding the impact to Hungary and European security, I think it would be tragic. I agree, and you also mentioned that Putin does not stop in Ukraine. He dreams of great power Russia with a sphere of influence, preferably entire Europe. And I think Hungary has enough experience of being in that sphere of influence to fear that.
I think one final question for all of you. We have only a couple minutes left. We've discussed quite a bit already, but I'd like to close our discussion with a brief thought experiment. What would Hungary look like outside of NATO?
I think, well, my starting point would be that NATO is the cornerstone of Hungarian security and the security guarantor of the region. And it links back also to our discussion about supporting Ukraine or not supporting Ukraine, being in NATO or not being in NATO. Being in NATO is also about upholding certain international norms, respect for international law that guarantees that there is peace, that there is respect for, well, actual sovereignty of countries, territorial integrity of countries. And when we are Also talking about supporting Ukraine, I do believe that these are the very principles that have been violated. And if we just accept that and stop supporting, then we essentially acknowledge that this can be done. And a Hungary outside of NATO, I do believe, which how would that look like? Either a dissolution of NATO or Hungary's willing departure of NATO, therefore Hungary's willing abandonment of such rules. I do believe that for such a small country, which definitely cannot guarantee its own security to begin with, it would be detrimental.
It would be tragic, and Hungary would be a completely insignificant country without NATO membership, and economically also not a good place to invest, and prosperity would be gone as well. I just checked the GDP per capita in Serbia and Belarus, and basically it's 50% or less than 50%, and I think not having the security guarantee basically destroys not only our sense of security, peace, but also our economy.
Yes, I think, of course, there are countries outside NATO that can be very prosperous. Let's think about Austria and others. I think, by the way, it's also an important element that right now we can see that Hungary is emphasizing its alliance with two countries that are, neither of them are NATO members, Serbia and Austria. And without having any problems with the bilateral relationship with these countries, I think it's important in itself. I don't think Hungary could make this move. I don't think even Hungary wants to make this move. And let me bring one additional argument beyond what already mentioned. I think for countries like Hungary, between the East and the West, with sometimes hesitating in which direction to go, institutions such as EU and NATO, and we are celebrating today, this year also the 20th year of our EU membership, are not just security providers, providers of economic prosperity, but also normalcy providers in terms of foreign policy. And I think outside of NATO, we could just see much more deviation from the Western mainstream towards the East, and therefore I think we can be rather grateful for Hungary's for the NATO membership of Hungary.
Thanks. As we wrap this up, I'd like to thank CEU and the Democracy Institute for their important work, not just here in the building and helping us, give us a place to come, but also I think they deserve some acknowledgement here in organizing the Invisible University for Ukraine program, which supports the academic goals of Ukrainian students affected by the war. Moreover, I'd like to thank Laszlo Brust and other people at DI and elsewhere who see what is happening in the region. And while many of us get bogged down in the grind of war, there are people who respond to these events by driving discussions and working with others to propose policies on how, when the opportunity presents itself, to win the peace. I ask that you all join me here in giving them a round of applause as a show of gratitude for their work and their graciousness as hosts.
Thank you, Ben, and members of the panel for the fascinating discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a quick 5-minute stretch break before Ambassador Pressman's keynotes. Please plan to be back in your seats by about 2:25, 2:26. Thank you very much.
No.
Ladies and gentlemen, for our final event today, I'd like to invite U.S. Ambassador David Pressman to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Excellencies, representatives of the Diplomatic Corps, representatives of American businesses here in Hungary, Hungary's second largest foreign job creator, colleagues, distinguished guests. Thank you for joining us this afternoon to take stock of 25 years of Hungary's membership in the most successful alliance, military alliance in the history of the world. In particular, I'd like to thank Minister Géza Jeszenszky for his poignant remarks. I always listen closely to what Minister Yazinski has to say, and I always learn something by doing so. Thank you. I'd also like to thank our panelists, Peter Kreko, Dora Jorfi, Zsuzsanna Vég, as well as Ben Novak for your fascinating discussion, provocative questions. And finally, I'd like to thank the Democracy Institute for hosting us here today. Just 5 years ago, these halls were filled with the best and brightest students studying at the preeminent university in all of Central Europe. This is still happening, but it is happening 250 kilometers west of here in Vienna. Central European University once belonged in Hungary, which prided itself as being at the heart of Central Europe. But the fact that Central European University moved further to the west, as Hungary opened eastward, feels significant. Where there were once Hungarian students cramming for exams down the hall, there is now a nice brunch spot. So while I won't spend much time on the saga of what the Hungarian government put this university through over the objections, I might add, of the previous US administration, I think it is fitting to mention because it epitomizes the sacrifice of something great in exchange for, honestly, it's hard for me to understand, in exchange for talking points, political points. Whatever was gained, it's clear that Hungary lost when it lost these students. It's fitting to mention CEU's history because it is not a unique story in Hungary. Just over 100 kilometers from here, members of the United States Armed Forces are living and working alongside their Hungarian counterparts at Papa Air Base. These brave young men and women, along with other American service members currently deployed at Camp Croft, have traveled thousands of miles from their hometowns to defend America and its interests wherever that may take them. They come to the very frontier of the Transatlantic Alliance, from American cities and towns most Hungarians have never heard of. Places like Moline, Illinois, Mena, Arkansas, Milburn, Oklahoma, Shelbyville, Indiana. Each and every one of them has taken an oath to defend their country. But they have done something greater. They not only have an obligation, if necessary, to risk their lives for their country, for the United States, but if called upon to do so, for our NATO allies. These courageous men and women are prepared to make the ultimate sacrifice for the allies of the United States of America, for Hungary, for Hungarians. This commitment should not be taken lightly. It represents a living commitment to protect Hungarians by America's sons and daughters. Hungary is in the club of democracies sworn to protect one another, a full-fledged member of the most successful military alliance the world has ever known. Hungary is far from alone. And how are these young American service members from Moline and Shelbyville and Milburn and Mena welcomed here in Hungary? On the one hand, They have been welcomed warmly by their counterparts in the Hungarian military, as well as by the Hungarian people more broadly, who understand that deployments like this are a reflection of the strong ties between the Hungarian and American peoples. On the other, for more than 3 years, in violation of our defense cooperation agreement, the Hungarian government has not allowed these young soldiers to get license plates for their family cars. Instead, forcing them to pay tens of thousands of forints out of their pocket every month for temporary registrations. Not because of bureaucracy or red tape, because the Hungarian government has made a political decision to do so. Yes, you heard me right. I'm talking about license plates. Of course, this speech isn't about license plates, but this issue is indicative of the current concerning state of Hungary's relationship with its allies. It has not always been this way, and it does not need to remain so. So as we reflect on 25 years of our alliance, let's look at where we have been. America's friendship with Hungary goes back centuries. In 2021, our nation celebrated 100 years of diplomatic relations, but our relationship stretches back much further. When brave Americans fought for their independence from the British Empire, it was Hungarian nobleman Mihai Kovács who helped lead and ultimately died alongside the US cavalry in the American Revolution. During the American Civil War, President Lincoln's affirmation in the Gettysburg Address that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from earth, took inspiration in that dark hour from the great Hungarian reformer and democratic revolutionary leader Lajos Kossuth, who said, quote, all for the people and all by the people. America today is home to immigrants from all over the world, including a vibrant and proud Hungarian diaspora that sought refuge from totalitarianism in the 1930s, found safe haven after the 1956 revolution, and became an integral part of the American family. They include visionary thinkers like scientist Edward Teller and Leo Szilard, mathematician John von Neumann, cinematic giants Michael Curtiz and Adolf Zukor, technology pioneer Andrew Grove, who escaped to the United States after Moscow crushed Hungary's 1956 revolution and became one of the key architects of the computer industry. They also include great American innovators like our newest Nobel laureate, Katalin Karikó, who left communist Hungary for the freedom of the United States in 1985 so that she could continue her research into mRNA vaccines, pushing forward advancements that decades later would save countless lives in the fight against COVID-19. What unites these connections between our two nations is the shared longing of our peoples for liberty and democracy, and a determination for freedom that is unrelenting and defining. Hungary's long road to freedom reached a milestone nearly 25 years ago, when it was welcomed into the Transatlantic Alliance. At the time, many, including myself, regarded former Warsaw Pact countries joining the Washington Treaty as righting a historic wrong. Hungary had found itself on the wrong side of its historical destiny, excluded from Europe, left out of the community of democracies. Viktor Orban, who was the prime minister when Hungary joined NATO in 1999, understood this. When he delivered a speech at the first raising of the Hungarian flag as a NATO member in Brussels, he said, and I quote, "I cannot help feeling that history is rewarding the efforts of Hungarians in 1956 in accepting Hungary as an ally into NATO, into what he called, and I quote, the alliance of the West." Prime Minister Orban lamented the long years Hungary's boat had tarried in open waters, vulnerable. Hungary may have become free in 1991, but it continued to be buffeted by threatening forces. But by joining NATO, Prime Minister Orban affirmed, quote, "We now finally have anchored our country to the western coast." Orban also emphasized the importance of establishing democracy and the rule of law alongside neighbors that had likewise emerged from 40 years of communist dictatorship. A solid quote, a quote from Prime Minister Orban, quote, "A solid pillar of our joining the alliance is that we," referring to Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic, "succeeded in building such countries," he stated, that is, democratic countries. And he was right. Hungary was not admitted to NATO because of its tragic history, but because of its commitment to a democratic future and its ability to contribute to the security of a transatlantic community of democracies, a community from which Hungary now finds itself increasingly isolated. So where does this relationship stand today? This brings me back to the license plate issue with which I began my remarks. This license plate issue has remained unresolved for over 3 years. Ministers of this government have assured us that it would be solved, only later to concede that solving it was beyond their power on hold from the top. Hungary's boat may be firmly anchored, but American service members can't register their cars. In the grand scheme of things, the issue with the license plates should be a triviality, a bit of red tape easily solved, but for some reason it isn't. It isn't because the Hungarian government doesn't want it to be. But as I said earlier, this speech is not about license plates. It is about an ally that behaves unlike any other. It is about a government that labels and treats the United States as a, quote, adversary, while making policy choices that increasingly isolate it from friends and allies. This speech is about a longtime friend and ally saying and doing things that undermine trust and friendship. We cannot ignore it when the Speaker of Hungary's National Assembly asserts that Putin's war in Ukraine is actually, quote, led by the United States. We cannot ignore a sitting minister referring to the United States as a corpse whose nails continue to grow. We can neither understand nor accept the Prime Minister identifying the United States as a top adversary of our ally, Hungary, or his assertion that the United States government is trying to overthrow the Hungarian government, literally to, quote, defeat him. So some say we should watch what Hungary does, not what it says. But you see, that is now precisely the problem. I am not talking merely about what the government says, but what it does, its actions. The systematic takeover of independent media, where oligarchs purchased media outlets only to gift them to a government-controlled foundation, while the few outlets that remained independent faced investigations, tax audits, and the loss of advertising revenue. These are not words, but actions. Ensuring all aspects of government power, from procurement to licensing to tourism subsidies to concessions to tax and audit actions to regulatory policy, provide favorable treatment for companies owned by party leaders or their families, in-laws, or old friends. These are not words, but actions. The Defense of Sovereignty Act that threatens anyone involved in, quote, democratic debate or, quote, advocacy, in defense not of Hungary's sovereignty, but only of a single party's effort to monopolize public discourse, even if not fully implemented, the law's mere existence serves its purpose, which is to frighten people into silence. These are not words, but actions. Equating independence with opposition, independent media in Hungary gets labeled opposition media. Independent non-governmental organizations get labeled political partisans. Independent judges who voice opinions unfavorable to the government or meet with the American ambassador are labeled politicians funded and directed from abroad. So rhetorical shell games that tell you to look anywhere other than where the actual ball is hidden was typical of Eastern Bloc countries during the Cold War. Russia continues that tragic tradition today. It's not something we expect from allies. No doubt you've noticed at this point that we do not ordinarily give speeches like this in other allied countries. Because with other allied countries, what we have is dialogue. This government appears to have little interest in constructive dialogue to solve these problems. With other allies, we engage, we collaborate, we work together, even where we have differences. Here, that doesn't work until we act. And that is why the United States policy in Hungary is best understood as a continuum of three elements: a continuous effort to engage by seeking dialogue, a commitment to speaking with candor about what we are seeing, and a readiness to act in response to choices the government is making. This will not change. We will continue to engage. We will continue to speak clearly, and we will continue to act in support of our interests in that order. If this government were to engage in meaningful dialogue, the rest would not be so necessary. And this is precisely what we have been doing. During the Trump administration, the United States warned Hungary about the dangers of hosting the Russian International Investment Bank in Budapest. We continued these warnings after Russia's renewed invasion of Ukraine. Unfortunately, the government decided not to wind down, but to double down, not to close the Kremlin platform, but to increase Hungary's investment in it. After literally years of traditional ally-to-ally dialogue, we met the reality of Hungary's policy choice to deepen its relations with this opaque Russian entity, despite Putin's war on Ukraine, and were left with no choice but to act. We did this not to punish Hungary, but to address a security issue multiple United States administrations had hoped to handle through dialogue with our ally, but could not. This past April, we sanctioned this Russian bank, extraordinary as it was to do so, to an entity within the European Union and hosted by a NATO ally. 24 hours after we sanctioned the bank, Hungary pulled out. Another example. Across multiple United States administrations, the United States has been engaging Hungary about security vulnerabilities associated with its expedited naturalization program's passport issuance. Despite extensive engagement in the Trump administration and the Biden administration, Hungary failed to fully address the United States' security concerns. So we were again left with no alternative but to act. The previous administration instituted a requirement for all Hungarian passport holders born outside of Hungary to obtain a visa in order to travel to the United States. When that didn't prompt action, last June, we limited the validity of the visa waiver program ESTA approvals for Hungarian travelers. Now, this was a step that we never wanted to take. Both nations benefit tremendously from our people-to-people ties. We want more Hungarian travelers to the United States, not fewer. But we could not continue earnest dialogue that led nowhere, as a real security threat persisted. Only after acting did we begin to see progress in addressing this security concern. And now Hungary's allies are warning Hungary of the dangers of its close and expanding relationship with Russia. If this is Hungary's policy choice, and it has become increasingly clear that it is, with the foreign minister's 6th trip to Russia since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with his next trip to Russia scheduled in 2 weeks, following his engagement with Russia's foreign minister earlier this month, and the Prime Minister's own meeting with Vladimir Putin in China, we will have to decide how best to protect our security interests which as allies should be our collective security interests. These legitimate security concerns shared by Hungary's 31 allies cannot be ignored. Hungary is also alone on the defining issue of European security of the last quarter century, Russia's war in Ukraine. As a friend and ally, Hungary's concern about the war in Ukraine should make it a valuable voice in NATO discussions, guiding the alliance as it navigates these troubled waters. As a neighbor to this war, as a country with long historic ties to Ukraine, Hungary should be a leader in this discussion. Instead, NATO is working around Hungary, as it did when it convened the NATO-Ukraine Commission last year. 30 countries, now 31 countries, other countries won't be stopped. It is not just that we disagree about Russia's war in Ukraine. It is that Russia's war in Ukraine made it clear that we can no longer ignore long-standing disagreements that are undermining our relationship and our shared security. The war has not divided us, but it has revealed points of tension that have for too long been left unaddressed. Neither of us can afford to wait. So in the current moment, with the stakes so high, the United States is engaging Hungary with clarity, with candor, and when necessary, with action. Hungary says it wants peace, and that is why it is openly calling for the United States and other allies to cut off Ukraine from military support in order to force an immediate ceasefire and peace negotiation. The United States also wants peace. We want this war to end. But the Hungarian proposal does not stand up to reality. Does Hungary truly believe that if our partners and allies stop our military support for Ukraine as it fights on its own territory for its very survival, that Russia would then come to the negotiating table? Or would Russia do what it has done elsewhere and seize more of their land, pillage more of their property, deprive more of their people of freedom, kidnap more of their children? The Hungarian policy is based on a fantasy that disarming Ukraine will stop Putin. History shows it would do the reverse. It is not a proposal for peace, it is capitulation. This is not the approach of the Transatlantic Alliance, an alliance that stood firm in the face of the Soviet Empire and emerged intact and ascendant while the Soviet Union crumbled. This is a moment in history so significant that countries that long resisted joining NATO have jumped at the chance to join this powerful alliance and likewise secure their futures because they understand what it means. They understand what Hungary 25 years ago well understood. Hungary could stand with Ukraine alongside all of its NATO allies to demand real peace, true peace, which can only be based in freedom, rather than standing beside Russia and calling for surrender and subjugation. At the same time, Hungarian officials diminish an actual invasion of a democratic country. Senior Hungarian officials conjure stories of interference in Hungary's own internal affairs. Yet, they seem to have no qualms about flagrantly engaging in such interference themselves. Prime Minister Orbán, who on one hand baselessly claims that the United States government is trying to overthrow his government, publicly calls for the political defeat of the President of the United States and actively participates in US partisan political events. Hungary advocates for electoral candidates around the world, from Poland to Brazil, all while decrying foreign interference here at home. Who leads the United States government, or any government, is a question for the people of that country alone to decide. My first boss at the State Department, Secretary Madeleine Albright, was known for her blunt one-liners. She said that when she became Secretary of State, her political organs were removed. Her point was this: At the State Department, we don't do politics, we do policy, and for good reason. She would describe American foreign policy like an aircraft carrier. It may tilt in one direction or another depending on the administration in office, but it does not make quick turns between parties. Just like we have enduring alliances based on core values, the United States has enduring interests that run deep and transcend party politics. Hungary's government would have heard that loud and clear from a recent bipartisan congressional delegation had they agreed to receive them, which is perhaps why they did not. While Hungary attempts to wait out those it disagrees with, whether in the United States or in the European Union, the rest of the world is moving forward. While the Orbán government may want to wait out the United States government, the United States will certainly not wait out the Orbán administration. While Hungary waits, we will act. I have addressed where we have been and where we are. And I have said before that I am an optimist, and this speech is an optimistic one. I'd like to turn to a positive vision of where this relationship should be. In short, we want what polls consistently show the vast majority of Hungarians want: a close relationship between the United States and Hungary, rooted in democratic values and shared security and prosperity, exactly what the Prime Minister said he wanted 25 years ago. And that is what we still want today. The United States and Hungary will not agree on everything, and that's okay. We don't agree with any country on everything. But as allies, we should agree on the big things, the things that matter most, and on that basis, we can work through any differences on anything else. We should be mutually concerned for the well-being of democratic values, institutions, and of our relationship, regardless of who has the privilege of temporarily leading either of our governments. This last part of the speech is how we can do that and how we can get there. First, there must be a political decision that this is a relationship, Hungary's relationship with the United States, that Hungary's government wishes to improve. We have already made that decision. Unfortunately, we see no indication the government of Hungary has done the same. The United States cares about Hungary. We care about Hungarians. We admire and are in awe of your culture and your history, and we want a close relationship. We're not really asking for much. Transparency, dialogue, nonpartisanship, and a commitment to democracy would suffice. We are prepared to continue to engage, reach out, pragmatically work to find a path together. Second, we must take seriously concerns about security issues expressed by allies, not use them as leverage to secure unrelated parochial political objectives. Whether license plates for our troops, or Kremlin platforms residing in Budapest, or travel security vulnerabilities, we should respect concerns raised and work to resolve them. Third, we need to recognize that a relationship between states, as any relationship, changes and evolves over time. How we speak about each other matters. There is room to criticize. No government is perfect, including my own. The United States' great strength has been our readiness to confront our shortcomings and to debate them openly. While the Hungarian government's wild rhetoric in state-controlled media may incite passion or ignite an electoral base, the choice to issue on a daily basis dangerously unhinged anti-American messaging is a policy choice, and it risks changing Hungary's relationship with America. In light of these systemic challenges in our relationship, US policy in Hungary will continue with the only approach that produces results: outreach, candor, and accountability. We will continue to reach out to the government of this country for pragmatic discussions about how to normalize this relationship and urge that a political mandate be given for those discussions to produce results. We will also speak clearly about what is happening and what we are seeing. We will describe what we see in Hungary and in Hungary's relationship with its allies, and we will do so unflinchingly. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, we will not wait. While Hungary may choose to wait out the United States will not do the same. The United States has not made a sacred pledge to shed American blood to defend French people or German people or Hungarian people because we value these peoples or cultures or languages or religions or cuisines more than those of other countries not in the alliance. We make that pledge because we share a way of life as free people able to choose our own government, not as nations, but as democracies. We commit to defend one another not because of what divides us as different nations, but because of what unites us in the family of democracies. And because these commitments protect both of our countries and our peoples. The American service members at Papa Air Base could not find Szabolcs-Szatmár-Bereg on a map and certainly could not pronounce it, any more than most Hungarians could identify Moline, Illinois, or Mena, Arkansas. But they have pledged their lives to this alliance of democracies. The United States values our alliance with Hungary and our long partnership with the Hungarian people. From Kovács and the US Cavalry to Kossuth and the Gettysburg Address. From Cardinal Mindszenty and those who sought protection from authoritarianism to Katalin Karikó and those who ended an unthinkable pandemic. Our history interweaves us. Our alliance binds us. Our ideas about freedom and independence unite us, from Shelbyville to Szabolcs-Szatmár-Bereg. We needn't agree on everything, and we won't. We needn't even agree on most things. But there is clearly work to be done. We live in turbulent times. No one can doubt that, but it is in these difficult times when friendships and alliances are most seriously tested that they might also be most strongly forged. This is not a time for political games. It is a time for steadfast resolve. While a nautical metaphor may be a slightly awkward fit here in beautiful but landlocked Hungary, this is where your prime minister began 25 years ago, and so this is where I shall conclude today. Hungary's ship proudly anchored to the west 25 years ago, and it belongs there. But this government's actions and rhetoric make it sound like it does not feel so firmly anchored. The United States would not be acting as your ally if we did not forthrightly express concern about the course Hungary is charting through rough seas of its own choosing. We anchored together 25 years ago as democratic allies. It remains our hope that we will sail forward together as part of a stronger and now larger democratic alliance, a choice that remains up to Hungary, its government, and its people. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. As I mentioned earlier, please feel free to join us in the atrium for an off-the-record coffee to discuss what you've heard today. Thank you very much and have a great day.